You know, this conference is about engagement, and I think who could be a better keynote speaker about engagement? Michael has really fought against a number of people trying to discredit, or in other ways, quiet what he has to say. He's remained engaged, and he's increased his engagement. You know, again and again, different forces have tried to suppress his voice, and again and again, he has kept going. Bill McKibben, a lot of you know, of 350.org, wrote this about Michael. Very few people have sounded more important alarms about our climate future, and very few people have paid a higher price for doing so. Michael Mann is a hero. Please welcome Michael Mann.
Thanks very much for the kind words. Very nice introduction. The title of that op-ed, by the way, was If You See Something, Say So. And indeed, I have a story to tell as a scientist who had no intent to become engaged in perhaps the most contentious societal issue that we are confronting today, climate change. I was a applied math and physics double major at UC Berkeley, went on to Yale University to study theoretical physics, and then got very interested in this problem of Earth's climate and using physics and math to model the climate of the Earth. And that work took me in this direction where ultimately I did end up publishing this curve that has become almost iconic in the climate change debate, the hockey stick curve, which shows that the warming that we're seeing today, the changes in climate we are seeing today really are, in some sense, unprecedented. That placed me in the center of this very contentious debate. And so today I'm going to try to share some of the lessons that I think I've learned as a reluctant and inadvertent public figure in the debate over human caused climate change. And this is a battle that continues. And so I will talk about my ongoing experiences and what I think I've learned from them. The first point that I always like to make in my presentation of climate change is that the scientific case is actually very straightforward. Okay? The fact that there's a greenhouse effect, certain gases back up. Certain gases in our atmosphere, like carbon dioxide, have this warming influence on the atmosphere and the surface of the Earth. That's not controversial new science. That's basic physics and chemistry we've known for nearly 2 centuries. Again, Joseph Fourier, the same scientist who discovered the law of heat conduction, understood that there was a greenhouse effect. And mostly we've been refining our understanding of the details of the science in the 2 centuries, nearly 2 centuries since. There's no debate about whether we are increasing the concentrations of these greenhouse gases through fossil fuel burning and other activities. In fact, this plot here, which I put together a few years ago, is already fundamentally out of date to the extent that you need to add another vertical tick mark here at 400 parts per million, because 2 years ago, for the first time in what we think is probably several million years, we crossed the 400 parts per million CO2 level of the atmosphere. We are engaged in this uncontrolled and unprecedented experiment with the one planet that we have, the one planet that we know to be habitable. Okay, so given that with the greenhouse effect, fundamental science, the fact that we're increasing the greenhouse effect, there's no dispute about that. What I wouldn't be able to explain to you as a scientist would be if the Earth were not warming up as a result of that. It has to be warming up. And of course, the observations tell us that it has warmed up a little less than a degree Celsius, about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if you're a critic, and as we've heard, there are some critics when it comes to the science of climate change. You might say, well, I don't trust those thermometer measurements. And I could show you that the oceans, if you think the land measurements are unreliable, I could show you that you see the same pattern in the oceans. If you think that the northern hemisphere measurements are unreliable, I could show you the same pattern in the southern hemisphere. I can show you the same pattern for any one of the continents. It is a very robust finding, and in fact, you can throw out all of the thermometer measurements. And I can show you dozens of independent lines of evidence that tell an internally consistent story of a planet that is warming up and a climate that is changing, much as we expect it to, as we continue to increase the concentrations of these gases. And that's the sort of evidence that led this very staid, this very conservative institution, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, operates under the auspices of the UN. Literally hundreds of scientists around the world who get together roughly every 5 years and put together a report that describes the state of our understanding of climate change, the science, the impacts, and the potential solutions. And by its nature, it's a conservative body because the conclusions of the IPCC have to be conclusions that essentially all of the authors can abide by, can agree to. And so it tends to represent sort of the lowest common denominator scientifically. And when the IPCC says the warming of the climate system is unequivocal, that means the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Because if you go to a scientific conference, scientists aren't debating whether the Earth is warming. If you read peer-reviewed scientific journals, you won't read articles disputing that the Earth is warming. That's about as close to settled science as any science can be. In fact, the IPCC has gone further now, based on the fact that we cannot explain that warming from natural factors. We can only explain it when we include in our models the effect of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. The IPCC has said it is extremely likely, and again, that is a very strong statement. The IPCC, to state something is extremely likely, it means that there's less than a 5% chance that it's wrong. Okay? And what they're saying is that it's extremely likely that human influence, not that human influence is one factor leading to the warming. We sometimes hear that, oh yes, it may be a contributor. No, what the IPCC is saying, it is the dominant cause of the warming we've seen. And even here, the IPCC is being its characteristic reticent self. Okay? Because if you read the technical chapter of the report from which that conclusion comes, what you'll learn is that humans are responsible for more than 100% of the warming that we've seen. And what I mean by that is natural factors like volcanoes and changes in solar output actually were pushing us in the other direction, and we warmed in spite of it. So we've actually overcome what would have been a natural cooling trend. We're responsible, not for most, but all of the warming that we've seen. Now, recently, earlier this year, I wrote an article for Scientific American, and I convinced them to take it outside their paywall, so you can actually go online and read the article. And what I pointed out is that just based on our physical understanding of the climate system, it's still possible for us to stabilize warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Okay? At this point, it would be a real challenge to do so. We would have to basically bring our emissions to a peak now, ramp them down by probably 5% a year if we are to avoid crossing the 2 degrees Celsius threshold of warming relative to pre-industrial. That's about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a number that the EU, and in fact, many scientists who have studied the impacts of climate change, there's sort of a consensus now that if we had to define a level beyond which we will see dangerous, truly dangerous, and potentially irreversible impacts on the climate, it would probably be somewhere in the range of 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And we can still avoid doing that. Now this plot here is also from the latest IPCC report. It's from the impacts report. And you can see at 2 degrees Celsius, when you look at these different measures of impacts of climate change, that's where you start to get into the red zone. That's where things start to look bad across the spectrum of impacts. Now, if we continue with business as usual, what I show in that article, is that we'll see somewhere between 4 to 5 degrees warming of the planet over the next century. 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, twice that much in the Arctic. And in the words of James Hansen, the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, we will be talking about a different planet. We'll be leaving our children and grandchildren a fundamentally different planet. It won't be the planet that we grew up on. Now here's to end the sequence with the polar bear. But what I realized in doing that, and collectively as a community, in our making the polar bear sort of the poster child of climate change, we wrongly conveyed to the public the notion that this is some exotic, far-off problem. That, yeah, maybe it'll be an issue for polar bears decades from now, but it's not really a problem for us, is it? Well, now everywhere I go, when I give a talk about climate change, I make sure to explain how climate change is impacting us negatively already, here and now, where we live, and whether that's Central Texas, where I was looking, this was about a year and a half ago, I gave a talk in San Angelo, Texas, which is way out in the western half of Texas, and I wanted to show an image that conveyed the devastating nature of the unprecedented 2011 Texas drought, Texas and Oklahoma drought. They lost 25% of their cattle. It was, again, an unprecedented and devastating event. And climate change played a hand, almost certainly. There are studies that show that climate change almost certainly made that event worse. Maybe it didn't cause it, but it certainly made it worse. And what I didn't realize until a member of the audience pointed it out to me, that this image was actually from San Angelo, Texas, where I was speaking. I just wanted a generic Texas drought image. Little did I know that I had actually chosen an image that was from San Angelo. It is what they used to call Lake Fisher, not a lake. As of 2011, went up to Maine to talk about climate change impacts there. The iconic species of Maine, the moose, are now threatened by climate change-related impacts, pests that survive increasingly mild winters that afflict them. Northwest Missouri State University gave a talk there. It was sort of the center of the 2012 Midwestern heat wave, a record heat wave. Right now we call an event like that a record heat wave. If we continue with business as usual, by the middle of the century, we'll call that a typical summer day. What is a record warm event either in northwestern Missouri or here in central Pennsylvania will be a record. What is a record event today will be a normal summer day. If we follow business as usual with our pattern of burning fossil fuels. Florida, I gave a talk there. You don't have to convince people in Florida. Well, actually, the governor you do. People in Florida, you don't have to convince, are seeing the impacts of climate change because, yeah, they've always had this seasonal high tide known as the king tide that comes every fall. What hasn't always been the case until recent years is that it floods the streets of Miami Beach when that seasonal high tide comes. And as we continue to raise sea level, warming the planet, melting ice, expanding warmer seawater, eventually it'll just be a daily high tide that'll flood the streets of Miami. And then pretty soon it'll be just average sea level that floods the streets of Miami. And we will have to literally retreat from our coastlines as the seas approach on us. And we're already seeing that in Miami. I gave a talk in Queens a couple months ago. This is the devastation wrought by Hurricane Sandy, which, as many of you know, devastated New York City, the New Jersey coastline. Now, Hurricane Sandy wasn't caused by climate change. I cannot state that with any degree of confidence. I can state with a great degree of confidence, about as close to certainty as I'll ever come, that Hurricane Sandy was made worse by climate change. If nothing else, what would have been a 12-foot coastal surge at Battery Park in New York City was a 13-foot coastal surge. A foot of that was global sea level rise, climate change-related global sea level rise. It might sound like a small difference. Actually, it meant 25 additional square miles of flooding in the greater New York metro area. I've been out to California a couple times this year. In the beginning of the year, I was out there and I was talking about this drought, this current drought, that hopefully will end soon. Well, I was out there a month ago, and it hasn't ended. California has seen by far the most extreme drought on record. The numbers now, it was the warmest year for California on record, unless something remarkable happens in the remaining month and a half. That drought, certainly the drought wasn't literally caused by climate change, but there is now credible peer-reviewed scientific evidence that it was made more extreme by climate change. If nothing else, warmer soils evaporate more water into the atmosphere. So you don't have to convince Californians that climate change is a problem. They are dealing with the devastating effects of this record drought. In the UK, about a month ago, I was at a conference there. Again, the UK Met Office, UK Meteorological Office, is about as conservative, sort of typical British, very conservative, proper institution. They're very reserved, and it's remarkable that they've come out and said, yeah, that extensive record flooding we saw last winter, climate change had a hand in that. Pretty remarkable that the Met Office is on record saying, yeah, climate change made that worse. Now, I used to talk about the record 2003 European heat wave that led to 30,000 people perished in that heat wave. It was a devastating, unprecedented heat wave made much more likely by global warming. And I used to have to talk about the 2003 European heat wave because it was the best example of a record heat wave that likely was made worse by climate change. I don't have to do that anymore because in 2012 we had the North American heat wave. We had a record heat wave that occurred during our warmest year on record here in the U.S. People died in that heat wave here in Pennsylvania. And once again, that was a record heat wave. But 30, 40 years from now, if we continue with business as usual fossil fuel burning, we will call that a typical summer day. So this is the point in the talk where I asked the somewhat rhetorical question. Okay, if the evidence is this clear, if the threat is this great, how is it that we have not yet acted to avert what may increasingly become a catastrophic problem, climate change? Why haven't we acted? And that is a rhetorical question, and to answer it, we have to leave the domain of science and enter into the domain of politics. Now, this man here, some of you may recognize, there's always at least one hiss. It pains me to have to say now that he is the incoming head of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, the committee that has oversight of the EPA, which is acting right now to try to reduce our carbon emissions through using coal-fired power plant emissions limits. Well, James Inhofe, the soon-to-be chair of the House Environment and Public Works Committee, has described climate change as the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. In fact, he's written a book entitled The Greatest Hoax about his views. And I have to say, the idea that you could get thousands of scientists around the world to engage in a massive cover-up conspiracy hoax and get the oceans and the ice sheets and everything else to play along with that. Many of you know scientists, and I can tell you as a scientist, you get three of us in a room, and it's hard to get us to agree on just about anything. We're sort of a cantankerous lot, and that's a good thing in science. True skepticism is an essential thing in science, as opposed to fake skepticism or denialism. So the idea that literally thousands of scientists would engage in a massive hoax is on its face somewhat absurd. And yet, James Inhofe was the chosen keynote speaker in the annual conference, the climate change conference of the Heartland Institute back in summer of 2011. You may remember that was the summer in Texas and Oklahoma were experiencing that record heat and drought. The Heartland Institute, which is an industry-funded think tank that used to advocate for the fossil fuel industry, denying the science linking tobacco products to human health, today are working for the fossil fuel industry in denying and attacking any science that supports the impact of fossil fuel burning on our climate. Well, they invited him to be the keynote speaker at their annual conference, and sadly he had to back out at the last minute. You see, he had gotten ill swimming in a lake back in his home state of Oklahoma, suffering from an algal bloom, dangerous algal bloom, as a result of the unprecedented heat and drought that Oklahoma was experiencing at the time. So he couldn't give the talk. And so there are many politicians like James Inhofe, like Joe Barton in the House of Representatives, who have been heavily financed by fossil fuel interests and continue to argue that the science is a hoax, that climate change isn't real. There is a vast infrastructure, much of it funded by fossil fuel interests and private interests like the Koch brothers. There's a vast infrastructure now to create an echo chamber of denialism when it comes to climate change. And so that's why you have folks like James Inhofe. And that's why I found myself in the center of this contentious debate when my co-authors and I published this curve a decade and a half ago. Came to be known as the hockey stick curve. It really demonstrated in a very simple way the unprecedented nature of the modern warming of the globe. And by inference, it demonstrated to most people that there is something unusual happening today, and it probably has to do with what we're doing, fossil fuel burning. This isn't just a typical natural warming trend. It's unprecedented as far back as we can go. Now, it's important for you to understand that this is not the pillar of evidence that some would like you to think for human-caused climate change. You could get rid of the hockey stick. If you don't like the hockey stick, and some people don't, there's a veritable hockey league now. Dozens of reconstructions by different teams using different methods, all coming to the same conclusion that the recent warming is unprecedented as far back as we can go, even more than 1,000 years now. Despite that fact, the hockey stick, because it became this iconic image in the climate change debate, was heavily attacked by a lot of those vested interests. They've gone after me personally. They've tried to subpoena my emails. They've tried to haul me in front of Congress and put me in the hot seat and attack me. Because that graphic has really been a very effective way to communicate that climate change is real, and I don't really like that. Fortunately, though many of my detractors have been from the Republican side of the aisle, there are also some heroes within the Republican Party. Sherwood Boehlert, who's the former chair of the House Science Committee, was one of the first politicians to speak out and defend me and my colleagues when we were under attack by his fellow Republican, Joe Barton, who was the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And by the way, I should mention, it's probably a coincidence that Barton was the single leading recipient of fossil fuel money in the U.S. House of Representatives. Just like it's probably a coincidence that James Inhofe is one of the single leading recipients of fossil fuel money in the U.S. Senate. Probably just coincidences. But that was a member of their own party coming out and denouncing what he saw as a McCarthyist effort to discredit scientists whose findings might be inconvenient to the special interests that Congressman Barton was funded by. And so the fact that we have folks like Boehlert around, Bob Inglis, a conservative Republican from South Carolina, who was primaried out of his office by a candidate funded heavily by the Koch brothers. So he's no longer in Congress. But you have folks like Bob Inglis and Sherwood Boehlert and others who are asking their fellow Republicans to retreat from this march towards anti-science, to not become the party of anti-science, to engage meaningfully in the worthy debate that is to be had about policy, about what to do about this problem. And so it's my hope that we will see wiser voices win out in that discussion, and that we will go on soon enough to have that worthy debate about policy, that we will no longer be debating in Congress whether climate change is real, whether or not it's a hoax, but instead what to do about it, because there is no magic bullet, and we're going to have to consider a number of difficult alternatives as we find a way to meet growing global energy demand in a way that doesn't fundamentally mortgage our climate and our planet for future generations. And it's my hope that we get on to that worthy debate and we get away from this unworthy debate about whether or not the problem exists. Finally, I always like to end this on a personal note because it's easy to frame the issue of climate change as an issue as a problem of science or of economics, cost-benefit analysis, or policy or politics. But to me, more than anything else, it's an issue of ethics. It's an issue of intergenerational ethics. What sort of planet do we want to leave behind for our children and grandchildren? This is my daughter here. When she was, I think, 6 years old. That's a polar bear above her, and I promise we're not torturing her. At Pittsburgh Zoo, you can walk through a plexiglass tunnel that goes underneath the polar bear's feeding pool. And if you happen to be involved in an NSF-funded project aimed at developing climate change outreach materials for zoos and aquaria across the country, and you know the manager at the zoo, you might be able to convince them to throw the fish in the bowl when your daughter's walking underneath. There's things happening here. But on a serious note, I hate to think that that we will make choices that ensure that when my daughter returns to that zoo decades from now with her children or even her grandchildren, she'll have to talk about how these magnificent creatures used to live in the wild. They used to live in the Arctic, but we melted their home. We still have time to make sure that that isn't our future, and indeed, we have time to make sure that we don't fundamentally degrade the planet when it comes to food and water and health and our economy and national security, every sector of society. If we continue with business as usual, we will see catastrophic impacts across the board. But there's still time to act. There's still time to make the decisions necessary to avert catastrophic climate change. And I'm actually encouraged by this development that actually was occurred last night at 10:40 p.m. It was the embargo on the president's announcement of this historic agreement between China and the U.S. to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so I was very excitedly tweeted the headline at 10:40, only to learn that they had actually moved the embargo back. It was 11 p.m. instead. Fortunately, the Washington Post had also gone live with their news story at 10:40, so the embargo was broken anyways. It was a huge development. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that. The two leading emitters of carbon agreeing to act, to take serious action to bring down our carbon emissions. I think that is going to fundamentally frame in a positive way these important negotiations in Paris that we go into next year, where we're going to need all nations to agree to mandatory carbon emissions reductions if we are going to avert crossing that dangerous limit of warming. So I'll leave it there. I'll be happy to field questions. Thank you. One over here, and then we'll just go there and then there. Yeah.
I don't have a whole lot of hope for the Koch brothers funded candidates to change their minds, but the fact that you've been on the front line of this for a while, I think an important question that we can learn from is what rhetorical techniques have you learned that can, engage some movement in climate deniers or climate skeptics?
Well, that's a great question, and you're exactly right. We're not going to win over. There's a famous saying attributed to Upton Sinclair: it's very difficult to convince a man to change his views when his job depends to understand something when his job depends on not understanding it. And unfortunately, when you're talking about sort of some of these Koch brothers funded sort of Tea Party Republicans. To them, it's an ideological issue. It doesn't matter what the science has to say. No amount of educational outreach is likely to change them. Fortunately, in the population at large, that's a pretty small sector, somewhere between 15 to 20% at most of our population are active deniers of climate change. And so the real opportunity is to take that confused middle of folks who are open to additional evidence, but have been, in a sense, hoodwinked by this massive PR campaign to convince them that climate change, that there is no consensus, that the science isn't trustworthy. Some of those folks, I think, you can potentially win over to the side of science by framing the issue a little differently from the way we might typically frame it. To think about some of the things that might be of particular concern to them and describe to them how climate change really is a threat. When it comes to national security, national security is sort of a highly ranked issue for many conservatives, and many of them are probably not aware of the fact that the U.S. Navy has declared climate change the greatest security threat we face in the decades ahead. They may not be aware of the fact that the reinsurance industry and the insurance industry see climate change as one of the greatest threats we face. That they may not be aware of the fact that there are many leading business leaders, captains of industry, who have embraced sustainability as a way to move forward in our economy. Just last week, we had Lisa Jackson, the former EPA administrator, here on campus to give a talk about what Apple is now doing. She's now heading up their sustainability division, and they are now 94% fossil fuel free. 94% of their energy comes from renewables to power their data centers, and they're not happy with that. They will not stop until they achieve 100% renewable energy, and they're doing that by deploying massive solar arrays. So it can be done. And Apple, one of the largest capitalization companies, at one point I think they were number one, at least for some period of time, but they're in the top few. If Apple can do it, then anybody can do it. And so I think there are opportunities to point to how the business community is actually taking this seriously, how the national security industry, the community rather, is taking this seriously, and to frame the issue in a different way from the framing they may have been exposed to. It's not just a concern of environmentalists. It's really a concern shared by some of the most conservative sectors of society. And then,
so recently, Rick Scott, Marco Rubio.
He's not a scientist, by the way.
Right. That's what I wanted to get your read on. There's this new "I'm not a scientist" thing. So, what do you think that says about the sort of the denialist or skeptic position?
It's a great question. I actually find that a very positive development. Because what it means is the people who are doing focus groups to advise these politicians, when every single Republican who's asked about climate change uses the same line, well, I'm not a scientist, it means that Frank Luntz, their pollster, has probably found through his focus groups and his polling that that's really the only viable way out for them right now. If they proactively deny climate change, the public no longer finds that acceptable. They no longer find that credible. They discredit themselves if they flat out deny what the U.S. National Academy of Sciences has to say. If they flatly deny what every scientific society in the U.S. that's weighed in on this matter has to say, that climate change is real, it's caused by human activity, and we need to do something about it or it's going to be a big problem. So they're trying to slip out of that by just saying, well, I'm not a scientist. It's like, asking the politician, that cyanide capsule you have right there, should you swallow it or not? Well, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know. I mean, you can sort of take it to its logical extreme. It's an absurd way of trying to get out of, many of these same politicians who say, well, I can't weigh in on the science, are more than happy to cite to 5 significant digits the supposed cost, that the supposed toll that that capping carbon emissions would take on our economy as calculated by some conservative economic foundation. So it's easy to expose the hypocrisy of how selective they are when it comes to climate change. Somehow they're not willing to acknowledge an issue where there's far more consensus than many of the other positions that then exists to support many of the other positions that they're happy to take. So, but I do see it as a good sign. It's a sign that just flat out climate change denial, the so-called Overton window, the window of acceptable public discourse has shifted to the point now where you are marginal if you're flat out denying the existence of climate change. I think that means we're headed in the right direction. Yeah, and then question, and then in either order.
Okay, the IPCC has an often quoted 97% belief rate among climate scientists. I know one, Patrick Michaels. I don't know him personally. You probably know him too.
I know him personally.
Yes, and he's one. Who are these other 3%?
Well, it was funny. I'm not sure if any of you saw this Stephen Colbert segment where he had 97 scientists come out onto the to the studio, and then 3 deniers, and it was playing on this fact that if you have when it comes to military risk, we have a 1% doctrine, something that's 1% likely is enough of a threat that we tend to say we should prepare for it. We should be, we should have a scenario for dealing with it. And yet when it comes to something where there's 97% support climate change, these same individuals say, oh no, that's way too little certainty for us. And so that number, it doesn't actually come from the IPCC. It comes from a study by a group of scientists. John Cook from Australia, I think, was the lead author on that. And they, basically reviewed the peer-reviewed literature and demonstrated that by a reasonable standard of whether or not an article concurs with the scientific consensus or not, the consensus is somewhere in the range of 97%. And some of the actors that you mentioned, Pat Michaels, is part of that coterie of a relatively small number of climate change deniers. Many of them, you won't be surprised to learn, do have ties to fossil fuel interests. They're being paid to espouse these views, and so one might question their objectivity from that standpoint. Some of them probably are just devil's advocates. In science, you always have mavericks and devil's advocates, people who just like taking contrary positions. And I've met some folks like that where they're probably not doing it as part of an agenda, but just because they like being contrarians. And so the different motivations for the various climate change deniers are probably as varied as the personalities of those individuals. The only commonality is that there is this remarkable infrastructure that exists, funding, organization, to take them and give them a platform and a megaphone and use them in an effort to create this sort of echo chamber of plausible deniability when it comes to climate change. And so, and that is being orchestrated at a very high level, and that is being funded tens of millions of dollars every year by some of these vested interests that I've talked about. So the individual scientists, in a sense, some of them are almost pawns in what is a larger and highly organized and well-funded disinformation campaign. But it's, it goes back to that Upton Sinclair quote, right? When you're a paid advocate for the fossil fuel industry, it may be convenient for you to ignore what the science is telling you. And I'm afraid that there are some bad actors when it comes to that. There's another question here.
This is great, but is there anything, Doctor, that you learned from the UK and more specifically the EU in terms of the polls that are different there versus here? It just seems that, and there, as you said, the Met Office, yeah, sure, which and Ofgen has climate mitigation firms that are mandatory. Is there anything you can learn from, how that works over there?
I think so. I think, and I think it's great to be able to point to other countries, to point to the EU point to Germany, and even China now, as an example of how it is possible to move ahead in tackling climate change and incentivizing renewable energy. That you can do that and grow the economy, and in fact, the rest of the world recognizes that that will be the economy of the 21st century. It'll be a clean energy economy, and we're falling behind in terms of our competitiveness by not getting on board. And that, again, we get back to this question that was asked earlier in terms of the framing of this issue. When you frame it that way, when people realize that this is about Americans' competitiveness in the world market, and by not engaging in this, larger scale effort to incentivize clean energy and develop a clean energy economy, we're falling behind in terms of our economic competitiveness. I think that's an important way to frame the issue. Now, there are some factors that are specific to the US and Australia and Canada. In each of these cases, there are very powerful vested interests that have a stake in continued extraction and development and sale of fossil fuel energy. And we've actually seen Canada move in the wrong direction over the past 5 years, where they actually pulled out of their support for the Kyoto Accord. When the Harper government took over, they decided that the Keystone XL pipeline, or the tar sands oil, was a priority project for them. They even pulled in a lot of the same lobbyists who have been working with the Bush administration here in the US are now working with the Harper administration to help them with their corporate PR and how they go about justifying this move to towards incentivizing the extraction of fossil fuel energy rather than renewable energy sources that we need to move toward. So that exists in Australia. You have a very powerful fossil fuel lobby. In the US you do, in Canada you do, and in Europe that's less true in Europe. And so there are some structural factors which hamper efforts to sort of achieve the amazing amazing progress that's taking place in places like Germany, where they're moving very quickly towards a renewable-driven economy. And I think in Germany now, solar energy is out competing fossil fuel energy, and there are still efficiencies to be gained. Question here and then back there.
Yeah. As your approach to being an engaged scientist, summed up by your op-ed title of "If you see something, say something." Okay? Your graduate students who have observed the kind of price you pay, Ben Santer and others who pay, what are you seeing in terms of their thoughts, ideas about how do you engage as a scientist on these issues? Do they talk about this? Is it part of their graduate training that they get with you and others at Penn State? Do you deal with this explicitly?
No, it's more informally. And it is something that comes up, and it's something that I've often worried about, because I've typically assumed that part of the reason for the attacks against individual scientists is to send notice to other would-be communicators of the science, other would-be figures in the climate change debate, that if they participate in the public discourse, they too will be attacked in the same way. And I talk about this in the book. I refer to this as the Serengeti strategy, sort of the way that the lions will pick out one member of the herd and go after them. And that's sort of what our detractors are doing. Let's go after one scientist, make an example of him or her, serve notice with the others. And so it's really that dynamic that led me to believe that my only choice was to fight back and to become more engaged, and to not allow them to be successful in their effort to marginalize me and intimidate me, because if they were, that would indeed send this message to my colleagues. And I like to think that it's sort of backfired on my detractors. There are when you go to the AGU conference, the American Geophysical Union conference, the biggest conference in Earth Sciences, there are now dozens of sessions about outreach and communication and fighting back against anti-science, and it's all out in the open. And there are many scientists who are focused on these issues and have made this a priority, and they're researching it and have students working with them. And I also think that this atmosphere, while in some sense one could view it as toxic, you go into climate science and you may be clobbered by, Koch brothers, funded climate change denier. At the same time, I think that dynamic and that atmosphere has led to a more sort of engaged generation of scientists coming into our field. And I do sense, just from talking with students here but elsewhere, that graduate students today are far more engaged when it comes to the emphasis they put on climate outreach and communication. And some of that may just have to do with sort of the world they've grown up in, the sort of social media world, Twitter, Facebook. But if anything, I think the attacks have backfired in that we now have an even more engaged sort of generation of scientists who see their role as being not just to publish their work, but to communicate it to the public and to defend science when it is under politically inspired attack. Question? Yeah.
Michael, it seems that the environmental community has faced some pitched battles before, like ozone and phosphorus in Lake Erie and acid rain. Is there anything we've learned from those you think we can apply? This is a much bigger issue, but are there lessons we can learn from those things that we can apply to this battle?
That's a great question. I think, ironically, it's sort of the inverse of that. The forces of disinformation and denial have honed this playbook over the course of many different campaigns, and it might not surprise you to learn that some of the same hate advocates, fossil fuel hate advocates who are today denying climate change, were working for the tobacco industry, denying the impacts of smoking tobacco. We're working for the chemical industry, and sort of what I call all-purpose deniers, denier for hire, various terms that I use to describe it. And so the other side has actually, through these various campaigns, finally honed their technique. And the attacks against climate change in particular, the efforts to discredit climate change, there was a whole infrastructure and playbook that existed from those previous campaigns, from the tobacco campaign. Many of the same lobbyists, many of the same paid scientists and advocates. At the same time, I think we can draw some lessons too. And one of the lessons that I think we can draw, and it gets at this issue of pessimism and doom and gloom. I think if we frame climate change purely as a doom and gloom, we're screwed, there's nothing we can do, going to hell in a handbasket, etc. That leads to precisely the wrong response. That just leads to disengagement. People think that there's no role they can play in making things better. They're going to disengage, and then the other side wins. So I think it's important to point to past successes, that even in the face of industry-funded disinformation campaigns, we managed in the end to act, at least in this country, on tobacco. Of course, the tobacco companies are now selling the product abroad. They're selling even more than they were back then. But in this country, we acted on we passed the Clean Air Acts. We did something about the acid rain problem, and that was under a Republican administration, under Richard Nixon, who founded the EPA, by the way. Something I'd like to remind people, the EPA was founded under Republican president Nixon, just like the National Academy of Sciences was founded by a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, in the 19th century. These are things I like to remind people of at times. So we can point to some of these past successes that might have seemed unlikely, that might have seemed impossible. Acid rain, ozone depletion, as you allude to, and we were successful. We turned the ship around in time. Not before, we allowed more damage than we probably should have. And today, there's still skin cancer, higher rate of skin cancer in parts of the southern hemisphere because of ozone depletion. So there already is this toll, this very great toll that's been taken. But we did act in time to avert what would have been a great catastrophe there. So that is maybe reason for hope that we will act here before it's too late. Now, this is obviously a much bigger problem. It gets at the very foundation of our current energy economy. In this case, we're battling the most powerful industry in a sense that ever existed on the face of the earth. So this is a tougher battle, but there are reasons for cautious optimism, and I like to point to some of these past successes as an example of that. Yes, there was a disinformation campaign. Yes, we acted later than we should have, but we did act, and we can do it here. Back here, yeah.
Hi, I have a question about the nature of your involvement with the university as a land-grant institution and meeting its mission for outreach that's relevant to the people of its state. For those of you that don't know, the land-grant institution is mandated by federal law to perform this service to the residents of its state. And each year, they have a new plan of work. And each plan of work has several bullets that are important areas that they're going to focus in, and one is renewable energy. And for the Penn State Cooperative Extension Plan of Work for 2015, the primary goal is regarding Marcellus shale extraction under the renewable energy goal. And so I'm curious, when you're talking about outreach as an individual scientist, which by the way, thank you so much for what you do regarding that, how do you feel your involvement with that particular infrastructure, which we have at our fingertips, to do outreach and co-create our energy system here in Pennsylvania? How do you feel as a scientist that you've been able to participate in that here in Penn State?
Well, thanks for both the kind words and for the question. It's a good question, and I do feel I'm sort of privileged that I'm at an institution like Penn State that not only allows but encourages engagement and outreach. That's part of my job title, it's part of my mission here. And it's great that that's formally recognized by the university as part of what we ought to be doing. The flip side of that is that they tend to be somewhat hands-off. There are faculty who, are advocating a path that's quite different from the one that I might be advocating here at Penn State University. And one of the more contentious issues, of course, is the issue of Marcellus shale and fracking. And to me, when I'm asked about this, my answer is there's some level of nuance here, because at a very rough sort of first cut, you might say, well, natural gas has a carbon footprint that's about 50% lower than coal. How much CO2 is produced per watt of power generated. From that standpoint, it might seem like it's sort of moving us a little bit away from this trajectory that we're on. But frankly, replacing one fossil fuel source with a slightly more efficient fossil fuel source is not going to lead to the sorts of emission reductions that we need if we're going to avert dangerous climate change. It doesn't really get us on the path that we need to. That is made even more so. It becomes even more problematic when one considers some of the uncertainties, some of the wild cards. That yes, from a CO2 standpoint, natural gas, 50% lower carbon emissions, but first of all, if we're talking about the total environmental footprint, then you have to be dealing with issues like water supply, the impact on water supply. And this is a huge problem in Texas, by the way. We are not so water limited here. In Western Texas, they are very water limited. And right now, in San Angelo, when I gave that talk, I was told that they're now trucking in water because the fresh water they did have was being used by the fracking industry. It was no longer safe to drink it, so they actually have to truck water out there because of that. So that's a huge trade-off and it's a huge cost. So there's the water quality aspect of the total environmental footprint of natural gas, and then there's the wild card of fugitive methane emissions. And we don't yet have confident estimates, but as I try to tell people, uncertainty in general has not been our friend. When it comes to climate change, many of the uncertainties, some people say, well, the science is uncertain, so we shouldn't act until we're 100% certain. Like, when do we ever require that level of certainty to act in any other aspect of our lives? But somehow for climate change, it has to be 100% certain. And in fact, when you look at how the uncertainties have been resolved, the uncertainties that did exist have been resolved over the last decade or so, in many cases, it's turned out that the problem might be worse than we thought from the standpoint of the loss of ice from the ice sheets and the contribution of sea level rise, the disappearance of Arctic sea ice happening faster than we expected, possibility of surprises, methane feedbacks that may make the warming even greater. Many of the uncertainties are cutting against us, not for us. And so when you do have uncertainties of this sort, like how much of that methane is escaping into the atmosphere, from a precautionary standpoint, that it would seem to at least give you some pause in making the argument that natural gas is the clear solution to our carbon problem. I think that argument is flawed on a number of levels, but I have faculty with whom I'm friendly at Penn State who have a different viewpoint, and I think Penn State's view is to be sort of hands-off and allow that to play out in the way that it's supposed to within the academic environment. I think you would find a range of viewpoints here at Penn State about the wisdom of developing the Marcellus Shale. And I tend to think that there are enough wild cards and potential problems here that to me it doesn't feel at all like the solution to the climate problem.